She didn't wake up one morning and stop liking you. It didn't happen in a single conversation or one bad night. It happened quietly, while you were still showing up, still trying, still believing effort would change the outcome. And by the time you felt the shift in your chest, the distance in her voice, the delay in her replies, she had already made peace with leaving. The most dangerous part isn't that she lost interest. It's that you slowly lost yourself trying to keep it alive. Most men don't fail in relationships because they're careless. They fail because they overextend. They sense something is off, but instead of trusting that signal, they negotiate with it. They explain it away. They tell themselves she's busy, she's stressed, she just needs time. And while they're adjusting their behavior, lowering expectations, softening boundaries, something irreversible is happening beneath the surface. Respect is eroding, not hers for you at first, but yours for yourself. The truth most people won't tell you is this: emotional withdrawal always comes before emotional disappearance. Long before someone leaves physically, they leave in smaller, quieter ways. Conversations lose depth. Curiosity fades. The warmth that once felt natural starts to feel scheduled. You're still talking, but you're no longer being met. And instead of recognizing this as information, you treat it like a challenge. Something to fix. Something to earn back. When someone avoids real conversation, it's rarely because they can't communicate. It's because they don't want to connect. Depth requires investment, and investment only happens where desire exists. You feel it when your questions are answered with placeholders, when your vulnerability is met with silence or subject changes, when you walk away from interactions feeling drained instead of understood. That's not mystery. That's feedback. And ignoring it teaches your nervous system a dangerous lesson, that your inner world is negotiable. This is where most men make the same mistake. They respond to emotional distance by giving more emotionally, more patience, more understanding, more access. They believe consistency will revive attraction. But attraction doesn't grow under pressure. It grows under polarity, presence, and self-respect. When you keep leaning into someone who is leaning away, you don't prove depth. You prove that you'll abandon your center to maintain proximity. Over time, this creates a silent imbalance. You become the one initiating everything, the one checking in, the one planning, the one carrying the momentum of the connection alone. And each unanswered message, each delayed reply, each half-committed response trains you to tolerate less while giving more. You start measuring your worth by responsiveness, by tone, by whether today feels warmer than yesterday. That's not connection. That's emotional debt. Here's something uncomfortable but clarifying. No one is too busy for what matters to them. Interest doesn't need reminders. Care doesn't require persuasion. When effort is absent, it's not because you haven't proven yourself enough. It's because you already have, and the answer wasn't what you hoped. And the longer you stay in that space, the more your self-respect bleeds out quietly, disguised as loyalty. Then there's the moment that hits deeper than silence. When laughter feels forced. When smiles don't reach the eyes. When you're telling stories, trying to recreate something that once felt alive, and you feel like you're performing instead of sharing. Genuine laughter is involuntary. Its presence made audible. When it disappears, it's not because you stopped being interesting. It's because emotional engagement has already left the room. At some point, she asks for space. And you want to believe it's healthy, mature, temporary. You tell yourself that giving space shows strength. But often, space isn't about clarity. It's about easing guilt while detaching. It's a way to leave slowly, without confrontation. And while you wait, suspended in uncertainty, she's not using that time to miss you. She's using it to feel lighter without you. Waiting is where men abandon themselves the most. You put your needs on pause. You stop expressing discomfort. You shrink to avoid pushing her further away. And in doing so, you teach her something without saying a word, that your presence is optional, your needs are flexible, and your boundaries are movable. That lesson doesn't bring people closer. It makes leaving easier. Sometimes the truth becomes impossible to ignore. She talks about other men, casually, repeatedly, as if comparisons are harmless, as if you're supposed to be unaffected. But comparison isn't conversation. It's a test, a way to see how much disrespect you'll absorb to stay connected. Silence here isn't stoicism. It's self-betrayal, because confidence doesn't compete, and dignity doesn't negotiate its place. This is the turning point. Not when she leaves, but when you finally see the pattern clearly. You realize the real loss wasn't her interest. It was your grounding, your standards, your ability to walk away from what diminishes you. And that realization hurts, but it also liberates. Because clarity is painful once, but confusion drains you daily. The shift happens when you stop chasing reciprocity and start choosing alignment. When you stop interpreting distance as a challenge and start seeing it as an answer. When your energy becomes calm instead of reactive, grounded instead of urgent. You no longer audition for connection. You observe it. And people either meet you there or remove themselves without drama. This is what real strength looks like. Not forcing outcomes. Not proving worth. Not holding on tighter as something slips away. But standing firm enough that what isn't meant for you can't stay. When you protect your presence instead of spending it recklessly, your entire life recalibrates. Relationships become quieter, cleaner, more honest. So ask yourself this, honestly. What would change if you stopped fighting for attention and started honoring your own value? What kind of man would you become if silence no longer scared you? If walking away felt like self-respect instead of failure? Because the moment you answer that, everything begins to change. Before someone ever leaves your life physically, they leave emotionally. That's the part most men miss, because emotional withdrawal doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come with arguments or dramatic exits. It shows up in small shifts that are easy to ignore if you don't want to see them. Less curiosity, shorter responses, conversations that feel flatter than they used to. You're still in contact, but something essential is missing. At first, you tell yourself it's temporary. Everyone goes through phases. People get tired. Life gets busy. But what you're actually witnessing is a change in investment. When someone is emotionally present, they lean in. They ask questions. They remember details. They respond with energy that matches the moment. When that energy disappears, it's not an accident. It's a decision happening quietly in the background. Emotional withdrawal often looks polite on the surface. She still replies. She still shows up. She still laughs at the right moments. But it feels different in your body. You walk away from interactions feeling slightly off, like something didn't land. That's your nervous system picking up on incongruence. The words say one thing, but the energy says another. And the energy is always telling the truth. This is where confusion begins. Because she hasn't done anything wrong enough to confront. There's no clear offense, no obvious betrayal. Just a slow fading of presence. And that ambiguity keeps you stuck. You start replaying conversations, wondering if you imagined the shift. You question your intuition instead of trusting it. You tell yourself you're overthinking, when in reality, you're underresponding to clear signals. What most men don't realize is that emotional distance is not neutral. It creates an imbalance. One person starts carrying the connection while the other observes. You become more aware, more attentive, more careful with your words. She becomes less engaged, less curious, less invested. And without noticing, you step into a role where you're maintaining something she's already stepping back from. The danger here isn't just losing her interest. It's losing your grounding. Because when you ignore emotional withdrawal, You teach yourself that connection requires effort on one side and patience on the other. You normalize imbalance. You accept uncertainty as part of closeness. And over time, that conditions you to stay in situations where you're no longer being met. Emotional withdrawal is the warning sign most people wish they had taken seriously. Not because it guarantees an ending, but because it reveals a truth you need to respond to. Something has changed. And the strongest move isn't to chase clarity through more effort. It's to pause, observe, and decide whether the connection you're in still honors the man you're becoming. When depth disappears from conversations, it's tempting to label it as a personality trait. She's not expressive. She's not a deep talker. She's just private. Those explanations feel safer than the truth because they keep hope alive. But avoidance of depth isn't about inability. It's about choice. People open up where they feel desire, safety, and intention to invest. Silence is rarely confusion. It's often restraint. You notice it in the way questions stop being returned. You share something personal and the response slides past it. You try to explore ideas, feelings, plans, and the conversation gets redirected to surface-level topics. Not because she didn't hear you, but because she didn't want to go there with you. And that distinction matters more than most men are willing to admit. Depth requires emotional energy. It requires presence. When someone is interested, they don't conserve that energy. They spend it freely. They ask follow-up questions. They linger in conversations. They let moments breathe instead of rushing past them. When that stops happening, it's not shyness. It's disengagement wrapped in politeness. This is where men start negotiating with reality. You tell yourself she just needs time. That if you're patient enough, consistent enough, understanding enough, she'll eventually open up. So you give more access to your inner world while she keeps hers guarded. And instead of creating closeness, you widen the gap. Because vulnerability offered into a closed space doesn't build intimacy. It drains you. There's a quiet humiliation in speaking from the heart and being met with minimal acknowledgement. Not because the response is cruel, but because it's empty. Over time, that emptiness teaches your nervous system to hesitate before expressing itself. You start filtering your thoughts. You share less. You doubt whether what you feel is worth saying at all. That's not growth. That's contraction. Avoidance of depth is one of the clearest indicators of emotional ceilings. Some people simply aren't willing to go further than where they are, especially not with someone they've already categorized. And when you keep trying to pull depth out of someone who isn't offering it freely, you're not being patient. You're ignoring feedback. The shift happens when you stop interpreting avoidance as something to fix and start seeing it as information. You don't need to demand openness. You don't need to push for clarity. You need to decide whether a connection that avoids depth can ever support the kind of relationship you want to build. Because real intimacy doesn't require convincing. It requires mutual willingness. And when that willingness isn't there, the strongest response is not more effort. It's discernment. When something feels like it's slipping away, the instinct is to hold on tighter. Most men don't respond to emotional distance by pulling back. They respond by leaning in harder. More attention, more patience, more understanding, more availability. It feels logical, even noble. If you care, you show it. If you value the connection, you fight for it. But this is where good intentions quietly become self-sabotage. Overinvesting doesn't look like desperation at first. It looks like commitment. You're the one checking in, the one making time, the one adjusting your schedule. You remember details, initiate conversations, offer emotional support without being asked. And none of this feels wrong until you notice it's not being matched. You're pouring energy into something that's no longer pouring back. What most men don't realize is that investment teaches people how to treat you. When you give more in response to less, you communicate that imbalance is acceptable, that your presence is flexible, that you'll keep showing up regardless of how little is returned. And while you may believe you're proving your depth, what you're actually doing is removing the need for her to invest at all. Attraction doesn't grow under excess availability. It grows under polarity and respect. When you overextend emotionally, you collapse that polarity. You move from being chosen to being relied upon, from desired to expected. And once someone expects your effort, they stop valuing it, not out of cruelty, but out of human nature. What's guaranteed is rarely cherished. There's also a cost you pay internally. Every time you give more than you receive, a quiet resentment builds. You tell yourself you're fine, that you're being patient, that this is just how relationships work. But beneath that story is a subtle erosion of self-respect. You start to feel taken for granted, even if you never say it out loud. And that feeling doesn't disappear. It accumulates. Overinvesting trains you to associate love with effort instead of alignment. You start believing connection must be earned through endurance. That if you just stay long enough, give enough, prove enough, something will change. But attraction doesn't respond to sacrifice. It responds to presence, boundaries, and the willingness to walk away when something no longer honors you. The shift comes when you realize that pulling back isn't punishment. It's calibration. You're not withholding to manipulate. You're observing to understand. You stop overgiving and watch what happens. Not to test her, but to see the truth. Does the connection rebalance, or does it fade? And if it fades, it was never being carried by two people to begin with. Overinvesting feels like love, but it often produces the opposite of what you want. It teaches others to lean back while you lean forward. And the moment you stop doing that, you reclaim something far more important than her attention. You reclaim your center. There's a moment every man remembers if he's honest with himself. The moment he realizes every conversation starts with him. Every plan exists because he suggested it. Every check-in happens because he reached out first. At first, it doesn't feel alarming. You tell yourself someone has to lead. Someone has to care more at the beginning. But leadership and loneliness are not the same thing, and confusing the two keeps men stuck far longer than they should be. Initiation is not about texting style or personality. It's about priority. People make time for what matters to them without needing reminders. They reach out because the thought occurs naturally, not because they feel obligated. When you're the only one initiating, it's not that she can't. It's that she doesn't feel the internal pull to. And that absence speaks louder than any excuse. This is where men begin rationalizing what their instincts already know. She's just busy. She's not great at texting. She's old-fashioned. She prefers when the man leads. These explanations soften the truth, but they don't change it. If someone values your presence, they find ways to include themselves in your life. Interest doesn't hide. It shows. The deeper issue isn't her lack of initiation. It's what happens to you when you accept it. You start waiting, watching your phone, measuring gaps between replies. You adjust your expectations downward so disappointment hurts less. And slowly, you train yourself to be grateful for scraps of attention instead of requiring reciprocity. That's how emotional independence erodes without you noticing. Being the only one initiating turns connection into performance. You begin strategizing instead of relating. You think about timing, tone, wording, trying to optimize your way into being wanted. But attraction isn't an algorithm. You can't negotiate it into existence. And the more effort you put into carrying something alone, the less space there is for it to be carried with you. Here's the part most men resist. Silence is an answer. When you stop initiating and nothing replaces it, you haven't lost momentum. You've revealed the truth. A connection that only exists when you push it forward isn't a connection. It's maintenance. And maintenance without participation is just emotional labor. The shift happens when you stop initiating to prove value and start initiating only where value is returned. You give once, observe twice, and decide once. Not out of bitterness, but out of self-respect. Because choosing not to chase is not giving up. It's refusing to abandon yourself to stay close to someone who isn't walking toward you. When you step out of one-sided dynamics, something important happens. You stop feeling anxious. You stop overthinking silence. You stop waiting to be chosen. And in that space, you rediscover something grounding. You were never asking for too much. You were just asking the wrong person. Genuine laughter doesn't need effort. It happens when someone is present, relaxed, and emotionally engaged. It's spontaneous, uncontrolled. It comes from being moved in the moment, not from politeness or obligation. That's why forced laughter feels so unsettling. Because even if you can't explain it logically, your body knows when something is off. You tell a story and the response comes late. A smile appears, but it fades quickly. The laugh sounds hollow, like background noise meant to fill silence rather than share joy. And suddenly, you're aware of yourself in a way you weren't before. You start monitoring your words, your timing, your energy. You're no longer enjoying the interaction. You're performing inside it. Most men respond to this by trying harder. They become more animated, more entertaining. They search for the version of themselves that once made her laugh easily. But laughter isn't a skill you refine to regain interest. It's a signal of emotional connection. When that connection weakens, no amount of performance brings it back. It only exhausts the person trying to carry the moment. The most painful part isn't the quiet that follows a joke. It's the fake response that reminds you she's not really there, that you're sharing space with someone whose mind is elsewhere. And each time this happens, a small part of your confidence takes a hit. Not because you did something wrong, but because you're offering presence to someone who isn't meeting it. Forced laughter often keeps men stuck longer than silence does. Silence feels honest. Forced laughter feels hopeful. It creates the illusion that something is still alive, that if you just stay consistent, it will return. But politeness is not intimacy, and comfort is not desire. Staying in that space slowly teaches you to accept being tolerated instead of wanted. There's a deeper loneliness in pretending not to notice this, in sitting across from someone and feeling unseen while smiling through it. Over time, you begin to associate connection with effort and anxiety instead of ease. You leave interactions feeling drained, wondering why something that should feel natural now feels heavy. The shift begins when you stop performing and start observing. When you recognize that real connection doesn't require you to entertain, impress, or audition. It requires mutual presence. And the moment you accept that forced laughter is not a challenge to overcome, but a message to receive, you regain your dignity. Because being alone is not the worst outcome. Being with someone who pretends to enjoy you is. And once you choose truth over comfort, you stop chasing reactions and start building relationships where laughter happens without trying. When someone says they need space, it sounds reasonable, mature even. It suggests self-awareness and emotional responsibility. And because you don't want to be controlling or insecure, you agree. You step back. You give room. You tell yourself that patience is strength. But what most men don't realize is that space is often not about healing the connection. It's about easing the exit. Healthy space comes with clarity. It has boundaries, timelines, and communication. It's mutual and transparent. What you're usually given instead is distance without definition. Fewer messages. Longer gaps. Just enough contact to keep you emotionally attached, but not enough to move anything forward. That's not space. That's slow detachment. While you're waiting, suspended in uncertainty, something shifts inside you. You start monitoring your behavior, afraid that one wrong move will push her further away. You suppress your needs. You tell yourself not to ask for reassurance, not to express confusion. not to be too much. And in doing so, you quietly abandon yourself to preserve the possibility of her return. This is where hope becomes a trap. You believe that if you respect her request, she'll miss you, that your absence will remind her of your value. But people don't miss what they've already emotionally released. Space doesn't revive attraction when attraction is already gone. It simply makes the separation feel cleaner for the person leaving. Often, she'll still reach out just enough to keep the door open. A check-in, a reaction, a brief message that reignites your hope. And you cling to those moments, interpreting them as signs that things aren't over. But consistency is the language of care. Anything less is confusion disguised as kindness. The deeper truth is this: someone who wants to be with you doesn't need distance to decide. They communicate. They work through discomfort. They lean in, not away. When space is used as a buffer instead of a bridge, it's a signal that the emotional bond is already weakening, even if the words haven't caught up yet. The shift happens when you stop treating space as something to endure and start treating it as information. You don't argue. You don't chase. You don't wait in emotional limbo. You accept what's being shown. And instead of freezing your life in place, you redirect your energy back to yourself, your growth, your direction. Because staying emotionally available to someone who is emotionally withdrawing doesn't make you patient. It makes you invisible. And the moment you choose to step out of that dynamic, space stops hurting. It clarifies. Not because it brings her back, but because it brings you back to yourself. When she brings up other men around you, it's rarely accidental. It might sound casual, harmless, even playful, but repetition changes the meaning. When another man's name keeps entering the conversation, it's not just information. It's a signal, a quiet test to see how much discomfort you'll swallow to keep the connection intact. At first, you try to be unbothered. You tell yourself confidence means not reacting, that being secure means letting it slide. But there's a difference between being grounded and being dismissive of your own boundaries. Confidence doesn't ignore disrespect. It recognizes it and responds appropriately. Silence in these moments isn't stoicism. It's self-erasure. Comparisons are especially corrosive. Compliments about another man's ambition, body, humor, or success land differently when they're placed in your presence. They subtly shift the dynamic. You're no longer connecting. You're being evaluated. And even if nothing is said directly about you, the implication hangs in the air. Someone else is occupying her emotional attention. What makes this dynamic dangerous is how it affects you internally. You start adjusting, measuring yourself against people who aren't even in the room. You question whether you're doing enough, being enough, showing up the right way. And without realizing it, your sense of worth begins leaning on comparison instead of alignment. That's not attraction. That's insecurity being cultivated. Talking about other men is often a way to create leverage. It introduces competition where none should exist. And competition forces you into a reactive state. You try harder. You tolerate more. You suppress discomfort to avoid seeming insecure. But every time you do that, you teach her that your boundaries are flexible and your presence is negotiable. The truth is simple but uncomfortable. When someone repeatedly references others in a way that undermines emotional exclusivity, they're signaling detachment. Either they're already exploring options emotionally, or they're creating distance without confrontation. In both cases, staying silent doesn't protect the connection. It weakens your position within it. The shift happens when you stop participating in conversations that reduce you, not through arguments or ultimatums, but through disengagement. You don't need to explain why it feels off. You just stop rewarding it with attention. Because a man who values himself doesn't compete for a place that should be freely given. Boundaries don't push the right people away. They filter out the wrong ones. And the moment you stop reacting to subtle disrespect, one of two things happens. She adjusts and respects you, or she drifts and confirms what was already true. Either outcome restores your clarity. Walking away from comparison isn't weakness. It's strength in motion. It's choosing peace over psychological games. And once you stop allowing your worth to be measured against shadows, you step back into your center, where no one needs to be diminished for you to stand tall. It's tempting to frame heartbreak or disappointment as losing her, that she walked away, drifted emotionally, or never fully invested. Surely, that's the tragedy. But the deeper truth rarely gets acknowledged. The real loss is what you gave away in the process of staying. Your energy, your clarity, your self-respect, your presence in your own life. When you tolerate one-sided effort, forced attention, fake laughter, and repeated boundary tests, something inside quietly erodes. You start negotiating your worth, compromising your values, overextending to fill gaps that should never have been yours to fill. And by the time you realize she wasn't fully there, you also realize you've already lost the version of yourself that stood firm, uncompromised, unborrowed. This is why heartbreak often feels heavier than it needs to. It's not just about absence. It's about what you sacrificed for a connection that was never reciprocal. You gave consistency to someone who only offered fragments. You gave focus to someone whose mind and attention were elsewhere. You invested in her presence while your own foundation quietly cracked under the weight of overgiving. Here's the painful clarity most men avoid. Being someone's backup, placeholder, or emotional labor doesn't just waste time. It reshapes your sense of self. You begin defining your value by the approval, attention, or interest you can extract from others. And once that becomes your measure, loss isn't just a relationship ending. It's a betrayal of your own standards. The awakening comes when you stop blaming her for what she couldn't give and start noticing what you failed to protect in yourself. The real tragedy is not being left behind. It's being left with less of yourself than when you started. Every unanswered text, every dry smile, every silent withdrawal, it was a chance to see your own worth more clearly. The moment you ignore it is the moment you lose a part of you. Reclaiming yourself doesn't mean punishing her or pretending nothing happened. It means shifting perspective, recognizing that your attention, time, and emotional energy are finite resources. That when someone doesn't meet you halfway, the real act of loss is not theirs. It's yours if you allow yourself to stay. And stepping away isn't running. It's returning. Returning to the self you almost forgot. The power lies in understanding that the connection wasn't your failure, but your overextension was. And the freedom that comes after isn't about revenge. It's about restoration. It's about building your life around respect, alignment, and emotional reciprocity. Because when you stop giving what isn't valued, you stop losing yourself. And that is the greatest victory of all. At some point, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. The overinvestment, the one-sided effort, the forced laughs, the boundary tests, the emotional withdrawals, they all point to the same truth. You've been chasing what was never fully yours. And chasing, no matter how noble it feels, always comes at the cost of your energy, peace, and self-respect. The shift begins when you decide to stop running after validation and start choosing alignment. You stop trying to earn attention and instead give it where it's naturally returned. You stop negotiating your worth and instead prioritize people and spaces that recognize it without hesitation. This is the moment you reclaim your presence, not by demanding it, but by anchoring in your own value. Chasing keeps you reactive. You're always on edge, measuring gaps, interpreting silence, questioning your place. Choosing makes you proactive. You decide who deserves your time, your energy, your voice, and your heart. You set the standard and live it, not hoping someone meets it, but confident enough to walk away if they don't. This shift isn't about bitterness or withdrawal. It's about clarity. It's about seeing relationships for what they truly are rather than what you wish them to be. It's about distinguishing between temporary attention and consistent presence, between hollow engagement and genuine connection. Once you internalize this, the emotional landscape changes entirely. When you choose over chase, you also stop tolerating subtle disrespect, emotional tests, and one-sided dynamics. You no longer accept crumbs when a feast of connection is possible. You stop allowing silence, avoidance, or manipulations to define your worth. Every action you take is rooted in alignment, not desperation. And here's the transformation that follows. Once you stop chasing, the right people begin to appear, not because you try harder, but because you're no longer available for anything less than genuine engagement. You attract reciprocity, presence, and respect by embodying them first. The dynamic flips. You're no longer pursuing energy. You are the energy others naturally want to invest in. Chasing is a lesson. Choosing is mastery. And the day you make this shift, everything you've endured, the disappointment, the manipulation, the hollow moments, becomes fuel. Fuel to build a life where your attention is sacred, your standards unwavering, and your presence so grounded that it no longer begs to be noticed. It simply is. The journey from chasing to choosing isn't easy. It asks you to face truths most men avoid. That overinvestment diminishes your worth, that forced attention feels hollow, that subtle disrespect slowly erodes confidence. It asks you to see clearly, to acknowledge what was lost, not as failure, but as lessons in self-preservation. And yet, within that clarity lies freedom. Power without bitterness means holding your standards without resentment. It means walking away from what drains you without hating those who couldn't meet you. It means protecting your energy, your time, your heart, not out of anger, but out of respect for yourself. True strength doesn't punish. It simply doesn't participate in dynamics that undermine it. When you embody this, everything changes. You no longer chase validation because your worth is already rooted within. You no longer tolerate hollow connections because your presence deserves depth. You no longer measure your life by someone else's attention because you've reclaimed it for yourself. And in that space, real connection naturally follows. People who align with your energy, who match your effort, who value your presence without tests or games. The most extraordinary power comes not from control over others, but from mastery of yourself. From choosing your path, your company, your attention, and your energy deliberately. From knowing your value and refusing to dilute it for acceptance, approval, or temporary affection. And once you do, you move through the world grounded, unshakable, and deeply magnetic, not because you demand it, but because you embody it. You've learned that the real loss was never her. It was losing yourself in trying to keep her. Now, the real gain is reclaiming yourself entirely. That's the shift from chasing to choosing, from dependence to sovereignty, from reaction to presence, from survival to power. And that power? It's quiet. It's steady. It doesn't need proof. It doesn't need apologies. It doesn't need justification. It's simply you, whole, aligned, and unafraid to walk away from anything or anyone that doesn't meet you at your standard. And from that place, life begins to move differently. Opportunities arise. Connections deepen. Peace grows. And for the first time, you're not just surviving in relationships. You're thriving, fully in command of your energy, your boundaries, and your life.